So they kept going on with insulting each other, writing each other. I think it's funny because like in those days you couldn't text somebody an insult or you couldn't call them. You had to take the
I'm
time
going to
to write a
dispatch
letter.
a letter. And what's so funny too is like you imagine you're sitting there, you got to sit down at home, fetch some parchment, fire up the quill pen,
Yeah,
start
get a good ink.
longhanding a letter, seal it. I mean, they had to really think. It's like, should I call this guy an equivocator? What if he shoots me? Welcome to another episode of WTF History. This is the show where we go through history's most amazing moments and try to get you to say WTF. I am the co-presenter, Mike Gatto, and I'm here with my lovely and talented co-host, David Quintana, the one and only. I'm coming at you live from very, very rainy Los Angeles, hence my attire. And David is coming at you live from Sacramento, although many of you are going to be watching this recorded. Yeah, we're live.
As I have said many, many times, what drives me crazy in our current society. And,
Can I guess? Can I guess?
Go ahead.
Presentism.
Yes. Yes. That's the beauty of history, man. That is the beauty of history. If you study history, you can figure all this out because there is nothing new under the sun. And can I tell you that when that was written in, I think is it Ecclesiastes?
Yes, very good. It's the book of Ecclesiastes. Yeah.
Yeah, where there's nothing new under the sun. That was 2,000 years ago.
I know. There's a bunch of jaded people writing something 2,600 years ago. There's nothing new under the sun. And also what I find fascinating about that too is, a quick aside, is there are Greek and Roman authors, again, 2,500 years ago, who wrote that there's about 10 different plots for plays. And I always laugh because people are like, oh, there's this new movie and it's got this great plot. And it's like, no. The ancient Greeks were saying that this, there's boy meets girl, boy loses girl, right? It's
been going on forever.
Nothing.
Everybody, nothing new under the sun. That's what freaks me out, though, is that Ecclesiastes was like written, in the freaking year 0, and they already knew then.
I think it was like 600 BC or something like that. But
that's Old Testament, right?
Yeah. But so let me guess, you've got a topic that involves like a really, really controversial president.
Yeah, crazy president.
Yeah, who like did things his own way and like had all this controversy.
Yeah,
which has never happened before.
Yeah, never happened before. Never happened before. We never had a president whose nickname was King Mob. I love that nickname. Andrew Jackson's nickname, well, by politicians, was King Mob. It's pretty cool. I don't know how grammatically correct it is, but it's pretty cool. King Mob. And what they meant was like, this was just some rough dude. He didn't know about all the niceties and the civilities of the game. He just knew how to get the crowd riled up in these, this vociferous crowd. And he was crazy because he's King Mob. Yeah. That was like, 1809. So it's like we haven't seen this before. So Andrew Jackson was our 7th president. He was born in the Carolinas, because if you look at old maps from the late 1700s, you'll see that the Carolinas stretch from like the East Coast all the way to the West Coast. Essentially, the people that founded those, they were getting the patents for those colonies. It was like you get this and like everything west, right?
Right.
And so they just went all the way out there.
And am I right that the Carolinas are named after a King Charles?
Yeah. No. Yeah. I mean, he was the king. He was the king in the 1600s, right? He was Mary Stuart. So, all right. So Andrew Jackson, he was born in the Carolinas in 1767. He was our 7th president. I mean, I'm not going to go into his life. This is not what the story's about. But just a little background for those of you who don't know. He was a wild man. He was a wild man. His nickname amongst the Indians was Sharp Knife. Because he made his living as a, quote, Indian fighter. That was his job. That was a job back then, by the way. I mean, it was a different world back then.
Sure.
And so, it was a frontier. It was us against them. And when I say us and them, I mean like all kinds of different uses versus them. It was us against the French, us against the Indians, Indians against the Spanish. You know what I mean? It was everywhere, right? It was just hand-to-hand combat in the 18th century. He was a slave trader, owned a plantation. I feel like I'm next going to say, and he died at 32. No.
Right. No, he's one of the few that survived.
He was a judge. He was a congressman when Tennessee became a state, when they took that west part of the Carolinas. He was a captain of the militia. And he was the guy, he gained his great fame in the Battle of New Orleans in the War of 1812.
Yes, I
So
remember
he
that.
stopped the British at the Battle of New Orleans.
Trivia question.
The War of 1812 was already over.
Yes, I was like,
Yes.
you. Thanks for letting me even ask it.
I knew where you're going. Yeah,
Yes, you did. Yes, you did.
The war was already over, man.
War was over, but no one knew. Yeah, shit traveled slow at that time.
Right. They just weren't on Twitter. So, by the way, if there had been Twitter in the early 1800s, Andrew Jackson would have been the king of Twitter, because that was him, right? He was that guy. He was like King Mob. In 1803, when he was a judge in Tennessee, he had a case involving a guy named Charles Dickinson, a Tennessee lawyer, very well connected, and he ruled against him. Charles Dickinson thought that he was corrupt, and probably was, honestly. I mean, knowing what we know now about Andrew Jackson, he was probably corrupt, but so are probably 90% of the people in office. I mean, you're out in the woods, there's no communication, right? It's like, stuff happens. We see what happens today when you remove media from some of these little cities around here, right? I mean, it
absolutely
goes to shit. And so you can imagine what it's like in the backwoods of Tennessee. So anyway, he ruled against him. Dickinson was very upset, kind of never let it go. So let's move forward now to 1806. In addition to being an Indian fighter, a plantation owner, a congressman, a senator, a president, and a judge, he was also a horse guy. So he raised thoroughbred horses, as everyone did. I mean, that was really the sport then, right? That's what everybody did. And so he put him in a race, and he was racing against the guy named Captain Irwin. And Captain Irwin was the father-in-law of Charles Dickinson. And so Charles Dickinson, as we know, he already has beef with Andrew Jackson, because he thought he screwed him when he was a judge. He thinks he's corrupt. So they put him in a race, and Captain Irwin had to withdraw his horse. Under the rules of those days, if you withdraw your horse, you have to pay the other guy some money for forfeiting that race, right? He got his horse ready. It's not his fault. So he had to pay him $800. Well,
that was a lot of money at that time.
That was a lot of money then, right?
That's a lot of money. More than that. That's like 2 years' salary. That's a lot of money.
So he owed him $800 for the race. For forfeiting the race. And they had a problem with how that forfeit payment was going to be paid. And so they got into a big argument, because I think Irwin wanted to pay it in sum, because it is a lot of money in 1806. And so Irwin had an issue with how he was going to pay it, Jackson. So, they got into a big fight. And then Charles Dickinson comes over and says, hey, that's my father-in-law. You got beef with him. You got beef with me. And so once again, Dickinson and Jackson start getting into it. Adding to this, Jackson had heard that Dickinson had been saying things about Jackson's wife. So Jackson was married to a woman named Rachel Robarts. They got married, great couple. I've read her tombstone. But here was the problem. She was married to another man when they were married. So he was a bigamist. Technically, he was a bigamist.
And if I understand correctly, that was really common at the time, because somebody would get married, right? And then their dissolution would not be final yet, but then like the records wouldn't be able to get to the other courthouse in time. I remember this vaguely from law school. I don't know if you remember more.
I don't, but I do remember that because of the recording of these if not transactions, but of these affairs, that there were usually lapses and misses. I mean, you could imagine, because yes, I am going to divorce my wife. Okay, we'll put that on the next donkey to Lexington, right? Yes. Where they will put it in the log courthouse in some box. Right? Yeah, I mean, they were all kind of,
And then the donkey gets stolen in a raid, and you find out 10 years later that you're a bigamist.
Jackson was probably a donkey thief too, by the way.
He probably was.
So it was true, right? So when they found this out, they went and they remedied it. She finalized the divorce against the previous husband, and then they got remarried, and so he wasn't. But technically, for a period of time, Andrew Jackson was a bigamist. And by the way, it would come to haunt him for the rest of his career. For the rest of the career, they would talk about his curious marriage. So he had heard that Dickinson had been slandering his wife, right? Calling her a two-timer and a bigamist and all this stuff. So Jackson already had his fill with Dickinson. But then here's the next thing. Dickinson wrote a letter to Jackson, and he called him a coward and an equivocator. So, like, I don't know about you, but if you call me an equivocator, right?
Yeah.
I don't know what I'll do, but I'll think about it. I was equivocating. Um,
I'm gonna save that for the right time. That's all I'm saying.
so they kept going on with insulting each other, writing each other. I think it's funny because, like, in those days, you couldn't text somebody an insult or you couldn't call them. You had to take the
I'm
time
gonna
to write
dispatch a letter. And what's so funny too is, like, you imagine you're sitting there, you gotta sit down at home, fetch some parchment, fire up the quill pen,
Yeah,
start
get a good ink.
long-handing a letter, seal it. I mean, they had to really think. It's like, should I call this guy an equivocator? What if he shoots me?
Yeah, right. It was
Like
wild.
a text. Yeah.
The good thing is that, unlike a text, you had many opportunities to pull that back,
Yes, you
right?
did.
So, but he didn't. So anyway, this kind of went back and forth. But then the death knell happened on May of 1806. He published a statement. I like that too, right? Because you could write the letter, but no, I'm going to go to the, like, Lexington Courier, and I'm going to publish a statement. And he did. And he said that, I want to quote, because I do want to get this correct. He called Andrew Jackson a worthless scoundrel, a poltroon, and a coward.
So I got to admit, you stumped me there for a moment. And so maybe you could enlighten me and our viewers. What exactly is a poltroon?
Well, you know how he called him a coward, right?
Yeah.
He called him a coward. Well, a poltroon takes it one step further, because a poltroon is a spiritless coward. So not only are you a coward, but you're a coward lacking any spirit.
And it's got to be related to poultry somehow. It's got to be like a chicken reference in the first part.
But it's not a POU, it's POL.
Yeah.
So,
still, I don't know. Okay, maybe not.
Well, for anybody listening, if you want to give us the etymology of poltroon in the comments, I would love to see those, by the way.
Yeah.
Or other cases where people had been insulted using poltroon. But can we say that was the final straw? So to show that he was indeed spirited, Andrew Jackson, at that point, he called him out for a duel. Now, many people think that Andrew Jackson was in hundreds of duels. I think that's kind of gone on throughout history. People are like, oh, Andrew Jackson, that guy was crazy. He was in hundreds of duels. He was actually only in 2. He was in another duel earlier. And in that one, both of them fired their gun into the air. Yeah. And in the other ones, while duels were issued, they usually settled it out. And by the way, most of the time in duels, people didn't, it wasn't like the movies. They actually didn't shoot at each other. Usually they would just showing up was a big deal to a duel, right?
Sure.
Showing up there with the thought that you might get shot. But so usually what they would do is they would show up and then they would shoot their gun into the ground or up in the air. I think in the ground would be better, right? Because, bullets come down. So usually that's what happened. So Andrew Jackson, in fact, was not in hundreds of duels. He was in 2. So on May 30th, Dickinson and Jackson showed up on the banks of the river at Burrs Farm in Kentucky, and they decided to have a duel. They stood 26 paces away from one another. Look, I got many issues with Andrew Jackson policies, right? Trail of Tears, overruling unilaterally overruling the Supreme Court, all of those things. I don't know. He was a complex man,
right.
But in some ways he was kind of a bad. And so Andrew Jackson, and by the way, I had said that Andrew Jackson was only really in 2 duels. Mr. Dickinson had been in 26, and he was known countywide to be a expert shot. Jeez. So that is important to the story. Jackson wasn't challenging to a duel some little backcountry farmer. He was challenging someone who had been in 26 duels. And the beautiful thing about duels is that you can pretty much tell what the guy's record in by how many duels he's been in. So if he's been in 26, he's probably 26-0.
Yeah, there might be some ties in there, but the guy's undefeated. Let's put it that way.
The guy's undefeated.
Yeah. So, and by the way, like, for viewers out there, right, like, obviously do some quick math, assuming a pace is about 3 feet and assuming they're roughly 50 paces from one another, they're about 150 feet from each other, taking point blank shots with pistol technology that's not as good as today, but still could kill you.
And that not as good as today is important. So they stood 26 paces and they stand facing one another. They stand facing. And Andrew Jackson told the marksman, "You fire first." And so Dickinson said, fine, I'll fire first. And he put his arm out and he shot and he hit Andrew Jackson in the chest.
Wow.
Andrew Jackson, to his very, very good luck, the bullet hit one of his brass buttons on his coat. And it went in at an angle, but it did go into his chest, by the way.
Sure. It hurt
from his heart, but it was aimed at his heart, but hit the button and was deflected. In a move of pure badass, again, not talking about his policies, he took out his handkerchief, he wiped the blood off, and he pulled his gun out. And he pointed his gun at Dickinson, and he pulled the trigger. Now, when you said the firearms weren't all that great, right? Well, this is important because they had what they call the law of snaps in dueling. And that is, you get a snap. That means if your snap doesn't engage the bullet and the bullet fires, well, that was your snap. So in other words, you better make sure you got a good gun because now it's the other guy's shot.
Sure.
So Jackson pulled his gun out, pulled the trigger, and it snapped. By the rules, Jackson should have now allowed Dickinson to take his shot.
Right.
Andrew Jackson, being Andrew Jackson, he recocked the gun, like the moment it snapped, recocked it, and shot. That time, the bullet went forward, hit Charles Dickinson in the heart, and he died.
Wow.
Ran to the floor and died. And Jackson, I'm assuming he put his gun back in the box, dusted his hands off, and went on to become president of the United States.
Wow.
And by the way, that never became an issue for him in his race. Never became.
Amazing.
Now, the wife became an issue. The wife became an issue, his curious marriage. That was used up and down the campaign trail. But the fact that he killed a man on the banks of the river on Burrs Farm in Kentucky never, ever became an issue because I think at that time, it's what it was, right? He was defending the honor of not only himself, a poltroon, but his wife, who was being called, all kinds of words.
Right. So what's beautiful about this is, so first of all, this is a story that I had maybe read, when I read history way back when, but this is one that I didn't know. And what I like about this and what I hope our viewers like is that this gives you something that if you're interested in this, you can now go pursue more reading. I mean, for example, like now I'm curious all of a sudden, when was dueling made illegal, right? At some point in every state, it was made illegal and it went from sort of sanctioned politeness, a way to get out of insults and to have honor, into something that was murder. People are also probably wondering, how do we know what happened? Well, I know the answer to that. There were seconds. There was a buddy that you would always bring to witness things and to make sure that nothing was curious and everything like that. Here, it's amazing that technically I would think somebody could have prosecuted him for murder because he violated the rules of dueling. But then again, these were not rules. These are not like laws anywhere.
They weren't laws. That's right.
Yeah.
Right.
And yeah, I think all of these things are things that hopefully they're prodding you, the viewers, to go out there and read up more on it.
Yeah, and I'm interested if you guys know more about like what a poltroon is. Honestly, I'm curious if you guys know more about that, or if you have something to add, right, on where the duel took place. Burrs Farm is where in Kentucky is where it took place. But if you have more about what's there now, I'm always curious. Like does this guy Burr his farm? Like, do they know that that's what happened there? I'm hoping there's some sort of marker.
And here's another interesting question for our viewers, and one that I'm probably going to research, and that is, what was the last president to have killed somebody outside of combat? It could have very well been Andrew Jackson. Obviously there's many presidents who fought in wars. The last one was, major shooting wars. The last one was probably JFK, as I'm thinking. Well, LBJ was in World War II, but he didn't really fight. I think Carter, some of these guys had different combat careers, but that's a fascinating thing. Who was the last president who killed someone in a duel in American history and became president?
Yeah, my guess would be JFK, honestly, in combat.
Yeah.
Yeah, fascinating. Just fascinated. By the way, Andrew Jackson became what is known as the father of the Democrat Party. He did. His brand of politics were then formed into the Democrat Party. When you think of him, you don't think of him as the seventh president. I always think he's like 35 or 40, just given personality and the way he looks and the type. He looks very different than a John Quincy Adams, but he actually,
Sure.
by the way, another thing, he was the first election denier because he actually won the popular vote against John Quincy Adams, but he did not win the electoral vote. And so they had what they called the corrupt bargain. John Quincy Adams, and I think Martin Van Buren. And he was the election denier. He called it corrupt bargain for the next 4 years and ran again. So when we talk about election denial and all this, it's been going on forever. Andrew Jackson, that was his deal. I was a victim of the corrupt bargain. I should have won.
And by the way, we will do another episode on Andrew Jackson and what he did as president, because there are many, many parallels to today. Everything from banking to tariffs. I mean, it's amazing to the way that people talked about him.
Yep. Look forward to it. Well, hey, thank you. This has been really, really fun. If you like this, please subscribe. Looking forward to your takes on Andrew Jackson if you want to leave something in the comments. And thanks, Mike. I love this one.
Thanks for having us.